So what are we doing? So the foundation of what we're doing is a subject that is normally called intuitionistic type theory. And giving it a name like this, I mean, and there's an unfortunate notational clash that's going to come up. So let me just call TT for this. Okay, I would call it ITT, but you'll see why in a minute why that's usually not what people do. Okay, which is primarily, but not exclusively, based on the work of the Swedish logician Per Martinlöf. Some of you may know this, who's been developing the subject since the early 1970s, so I don't know, let's say around about 40 years now, something along those lines. And based on, primarily you can look at it as an analysis and expansion of Brouwer's, the Dutch mathematician Brouwer's program of what he called intuitionism. Now, I'm going to say a little bit about this, but I'm not trying to run a course on philosophy of mathematics, so I don't want to get into a long discussion about these issues, but I'll explain to you, I want to explain to you the starting points so that you can get an idea, okay, so that you can get an idea of what this means. I'm going to say something here, okay? Okay, so let's look a little bit at a cartoon version of Brouwer's program. Okay, so as I say, I'm not attempting to run a course here on the philosophy of mathematics. I'm sure you can take such courses in the philosophy department. Okay, but I want to say something about Brouwer's program as I understand it. Let's just say it like that. And it's a working understanding that informs the concept of type theory. And Brouwer's program is based on two main ideas, which, depending on your perspective, can be either trivial or profound at the same time. So one is this, which is that the first one is that mathematics is a human activity or a social activity conducted amongst people. It just means that the process of doing math is about communicating ideas. So the focus is on language for communicating ideas, mathematical ideas. And then Brouwer then analyzed, well, I'll get to that, for communication. Let's just say language for communication of, well, mathematical ideas, mathematical concepts. So you can start out with that principle. That's sort of Brouwer's principle, at least my formulation of it, is, I would say, is blindingly obvious, except that it's not so obvious. There's a lot of people who have other points of view about the nature of mathematics. But I want to take it, it's a social process. And therefore, being a social process, it's fundamentally linguistic. It's all about language, okay, for formulating things. So if it's a social process for communicating, you have to ask, at least some idea of mathematics, which was Brouwer's point of view, you have to ask, how is it possible for people to communicate mathematical ideas? And you kind of have to start somewhere. And Brouwer's point of view is that the fundamental human faculty, the human capability, is the concept of an algorithm. Okay, Brouwer didn't use the term algorithm to my knowledge. I'm not even sure it had been coined at that point. But this was a work he'd done in the early 20th century, first third of the 20th century. It's based on the concept of an algorithm. The basic premise is that what all people, by virtue of being people, are capable of doing is following a step-by-step procedure. And by giving you a step-by-step procedure for accomplishing something, for executing, for performing, we could say, a construction. And this is where we get the idea that Brouwer's program is also called a program of constructivism. Oh, that should have, I'm speaking and writing two different things at the same time. Forming a construction. So if I want you to construct something with ruler and compass, I say you take a line, you take another line, you drop a perpendicular, you sweep a circle, etc., like the ancient Greeks did. And what have I told you? I've told you an algorithm, okay? And in fact, the Brouwer's principle is that the only way that we could ever be talking about infinite things is by virtue of describing how to get at them by an algorithm. That there is no other finite form of communication. That is the only way I could possibly tell you what I'm thinking about. So whether you believe that or not, it doesn't matter, because it's going to, you can argue with this or you could disregard it entirely, but it's historically significant and it completely informs what type theory is. And in fact, I'll get back to that. So the idea is that we can perform an algorithm, and an algorithm is a way of performing a construction, and he harked back to the ancient Greeks, which is some of the earliest mathematics that we know about, okay, that was ever developed. And it's founded on the notion of a construction. And then the radical point, which is extremely central to homotopy type theory, is this one, which is that proofs are forms of construction. And this has some surprising and important consequences. So the notion of a proof in mathematics is nothing other than the notion of an algorithm or a construction. I say to you, assume you have something that you hypothesize, and I say you do this, you do that, you do this other thing, you draw this implication, and voila, you get the conclusion of your theorem. It is nothing other than a program, than an algorithm. Step-by-step procedure for reasoning, but in which the things you're manipulating are proofs. Now, this is where you get the radical departure from every other approach to foundations of mathematics. This is where, regardless if you consider all this BS, there is a technical consequence of this point of view which is unique to type theory, which is the notion of proof-relevance. And this is central to the program, and that's the jargony way of saying it. Another way of saying it is that proofs are mathematical objects that we manipulate and conceive just like any other mathematical object. That there's no difference in character between a number, a space, a mapping, a proof, are all the same thing. Okay? That's a radical distinction, and I'm going to explain that more technically briefly, because if you look at conventional accounts of foundations of mathematics, which tend to be all the same story over and over, which is basically first order logic with a bunch of axioms, there's no pride of place for the concept of proof. That is, the proofs don't themselves participate in the mathematics. The proofs are off to the side. They're just like the junk we use to write papers. But anyway, they're not mathematical objects. And I want to be careful, because some of you are thinking, who've studied logic, saying, what are you talking about? Think about Gödel and all that kind of thing. No. That is the idea of a formal proof. A formal proof is a mathematical object, but it's only a pale shadow of what a proof is. And that's the content of Gödel's theorem, is that formal proof is a limiting concept because you draw a line around it. You say, these are all and only the formal proofs right here. You enumerate them. Okay? But what constitutes a proof is lies well outside of that. And in fact, Gödel gives a proof that a particular formal sentence in here is true, and that proof lives out here and it doesn't live here, and that's the content of the theorem. So you must not confuse formal proof with proof. It's very common to do that, and that's a mistake. Okay, and so that's something. So that's why I consider it important to stress this point, because I think it's widely misunderstood. So the important thing we're going to draw out of this is the notion of proof-relevant mathematics, and proof relevance is absolutely central. Is absolutely central to homotopy type theory. And in particular, we're going to show that we're going to establish some kind of relationship between proofs of equations are going to be somehow related to the notion of homotopies or paths in a space. This is the critical idea. The core of homotopy type theory is exactly to develop this analogy. That's what we're going to do. So they're really going to be proofs. They're going to be proofs in the way that Brouwer formulated what a proof is. There are certain constructions, which means, as I'm going to say in a second, elements of a type. I'll say what that is in a second. Okay? And the proofs of equations are going to turn out to abstract the concept of a path in a space, which is used as a fundamental tool in homotopy theory and algebraic topology, the idea of a path in a space. Now, as a matter of fact, the thing that makes homotopy type theory interesting is the fact that the homotopy theorists never thought of this idea. Okay? This never came up. From the point of view of constructive type theory, it's the most natural thing in the world. And in fact, as a computer scientist, I would wager that all of you as computer scientists with some experience in writing, knowing what beautiful code is, would have invented this if I told you to do it. If I said to you, what we're going to do is we're going to study the concept of path in a space, let's get started, the first thing you would do would be to write down an abstract type. Okay? And you would then give the operations associated with that abstract type and start working from there. That's not what you do in the usual formulation of like homotopy theory. Instead, what you do is you start dropping down to assembly language and you start hacking stuff up, okay, in assembly language. And it's ugly and complicated, okay? But it doesn't need to be. If you do things in the kind of type theoretic style, everything works out beautifully. Not only that, so there's two things we're going to see, is that not only is this idea of proof relevance and the good old computer science functional programming type theoretic way of thinking about the world, about how to write code, not only does it come out to be more beautiful, it's more concise and it's completely mechanizable. So we have a curious situation which I'd like to advertise here. It is not the only situation in which this has occurred, but it's a particular situation in which this has occurred. People have the impression, going back to Russell's Principia Mathematica, or maybe Frege's Grundlagen or Grundgesetze for arithmetic, you have the impression that if you're going to formalize proofs in mathematics, it is going to be the dreariest exercise you have ever undertaken in the entire world, and it's going to be horrible. Okay? This statement is false. Okay? The proofs that we do, like for example in homotopy theory, are cleaner, shorter, more informative, and more general, and completely mechanized than the textbook proofs done by, say, Peter May. So it's not a straw man, okay? They're better proofs and they're fully mechanized. Okay, this is a remarkable fact. We've seen this also before, like I'm looking at Frank, so I'll think of it, is the stuff we did in logical frameworks and in using 12 to reason about the meta theory of programming languages. These are the best possible proofs of the meta theory of programming languages. They are shorter, cleaner, more concise than anything else. If you start doing it inside of like Calc, and you start doing it as conventional mathematics, and I'll explain this, what I mean by that in a minute, it becomes a horrendous mess. Instead, we have, and what is it that I'm hinting at here with both of those examples? What I'm hinting at here is what is called the synthetic perspective in mechanized reasoning. So what I want to think about is this idea of synthetic versus, well, what is called analytic. These two words are used in different ways. Here what I mean this. If you look in the realm, if I put here like geometry, then synthetic geometry is what Euclid did. Triangles, lines, circles, and stuff are things in themselves. They're not sets of points. Okay, they're just things. They're just constructions as they are, and you axiomatize their behavior, and you work from the axiom. Whereas the analytic approach to geometry is sort of, Descartes, the sort of Cartesian view, where you say, well, the geometric figures are sets of points in the plane, and you have R cross R, and you start using the properties of the real numbers. Well, the same thing happens here if I look at homotopy theory. Okay. Homotopy theory, to fit it in here. This is the traditional, formulation of homotopy theory in any textbook that you'll look at. And in particular, when you look at the what is a path, you say, well, you take the unit interval, so this is contained in the real line. So you take a bit of Euclidean space, and then you map that chunk of Euclidean space into A, and that's called a path. It's a set of points in your space A, in your target space A. And so in order to do this, you have to have around the real line, at least, and then actually you just get various chunks of Euclidean space. So you take the Euclidean spaces as given, and then you start working from there. You're doing analysis, and you're using methods from analysis to understand something about spaces. Whereas in the synthetic approach, it's completely abstract, and this is what is considered in homotopy theory. And this is presaged in the notion of what is called a model category, which is or Quillen model category, which was one approach to trying to do things more synthetically, but is really done beautifully in Hot. And if we look at PL theory, it's the same. You can look at something like the synthetic approach looks at like LF or 12. I could look at it like this. You axiomatize the constructs of a type theory using abstract types in a particular systematic way, rather than what you would do, let's say, in Coq. Has been very popularized recently, but I consider it to be like insane, is to try to code everything up down into the primitive notions of set theory. It would be like a difference between, you know, sort of having a parser generator and then using a theorem prover to say that your input S is in L of G, where L of G is defined as a certain set, and then you use automatic theorem proving to prove that your string is in L of G. Okay, that's like completely crazy. Okay, what you want to do is have an algorithm for parsing. Okay, so there's a certain kind of analogy here. So what makes homotopy type theory work is it's doing synthetic homotopy theory. As an example of the thing that works out where the fully mechanized concept is much more elegant and beautiful and widely applicable and mechanizable, whereas the other approaches, for example, that you would do the traditional approach to homotopy theory, if I were trying to code this up in type theory, you would expect somewhere in there it's going to look like Bourbaki. You're going to say, oh, okay, a topological space is a triple consisting of this and this and that, and a continuous function is a da-da-da-da-da-da, and it would be like, okay, and about 100 years later we might get the real numbers done, and then we'd be able to say what a path is. Okay, but if you look in the development of homotopy theory in type theory, in Hot, in the synthetic approach, there is no such definition anywhere. There is no definition of what is a topological space, no definition of what is a continuous function, no definition of the real numbers, or we can do that, but it's like an exercise that we do just for fun, but it's not intrinsic to the way the theory is formulated. I don't have to think of paths as sets of points. Everything is quite beautiful. That's the thing I want to get across. So that happens here. So by way of, you know, motivating you for the rest of the semester, I want to sort of indicate this. So it's this idea of the synthetic perspective. So as far as I know, this distinction is due to Lavier. And it's just the idea that type theory is the intrinsic, the idea of homotopy theory is intrinsic to the notion of type theory. So let me explain now what I mean by that. Okay, so that's like a little bit of bragging, because I think one of the beautiful things is how clean it all works, even though it is fully mechanizable. So what I hope we're doing here is completely blowing up the idea, like exploding the idea that mechanized reasoning is inherently tedious and basically undoable in practice. I think that's actually not the case. Okay. All right, so now let me look at here. Okay, good. So, all right. Let me find my bearings here. Find out where I am. Oh yeah, so that's going to come up. Okay, so what is type theory? So type theory is an analysis and codification of Brouwer's intuitionistic mathematics, Brouwer's intuitionism, let's just say it like that. And it draws on a number of crucial ideas that were developed, subsequent to Brouwer's initial inputs. So this was not, an exercise in writing down what Brouwer said somewhere and amplifying it. It's, a lot has gone into this over decades. And one of the important things is bringing in the perspective of proof theory, which I'm going to outline shortly, and in particular, I would say, especially drawing on, I'll just write this briefly, Genson's insights into proof theory. So it's curious, I remember 30x years ago, I took a course in logic with Richard Platic, who was a very well-known logician, who said to me, who was taking a class, he said, "Oh, proof theory, the dreariest of subjects." That's what he told me, and I thought, I was appalled, because to me, all the interest in logic is in proof theory, and I thought, I don't know why he thinks it's so dreary, and so part of all of this for me is like a vindication, because I have to admit, because actually, so all of the insights, all of the things that matter that make, for example, in this class, homotopy type theory possible, are based on ideas that were developed in the dreariest of subjects, proof theory. Okay, and so good. So I'll stick my tongue out at Platic because I don't think he had the right idea, brilliant though he was. So this is where this goes, and the idea is, what you want to do is you want to systematize. What you do is you want to say that there are a notion of type, which type classify what are the admissible forms of construction. That's the whole idea. So the whole organization is that what you do is you say, okay, Brouwer wanted us to base the idea of mathematics on the idea of a construction. And so it's natural to ask, what sorts of things are constructions? And there's no definitive answer to this. It's an ever-evolving notion. People learn more and more what are acceptable notions of construction. But there certainly are quite a range of things that are, have been established and are well accepted. And so that's what the type theory, it's a continually evolving subject. Hot is part of the evolution of type theory. But there's some basic principles. And the idea is, which is drawn from Genson, is to tell you what are the forms of construction. You have what are called introduction rules, which tell you how to create, you might say, for lack of a better word, affect a construction. You could say affect a construction, to affect a construction of a particular kind. And you have what is called the elimination rules, and I'll show this in practice, which is how to deconstruct a construction and how to use a construction in the course of building another one. Okay, so how to use one, so how to create one, maybe how to make one, to introduce one is the terminology, and eliminate, maybe you don't like the word eliminate, but anyway, that's the tradition, which is to the opposite of introduce. You introduce it and then you eliminate it, you take it back apart. And these are linked by what is called the inversion principle, and I'm going to show this now in more detail, the inversion principle, okay, which I also like to call the principle of conservation of proof. Which says that the LEM, at the very least, is post-inverse to the intro. At the very least, we certainly have that. So the idea is that you can only take out that which you put in. That's all. So it's like a conservation principle in that you can push stuff around all you want and you can reorganize it in any way you like, but you never get rid of it and you never create anything out of thin air. Okay? So that is the idea. And what these things together tell us is this tells us what are the constructions, and this tells us how they compute. Okay, so the inversion principle is the foundation for the computational or algorithmic aspect, okay, of Brouwer's intuitionism. So in particular, I can also call this the statics of our language. It tells us what sorts of things exist, and this is to do with the dynamics, which is how you run them. Okay, so that's the kind of setup of what type theory is all about. And now the key thing is when you say you classify the notion of constructions, the big thing is it's sufficient to encompass all known, we might say, mathematical activity, or at least that's the programmatically. That is, this is what the intention is. All known mathematical arguments and constructions, in particular forms of proof. So the patterns of proof that we use to communicate with one another are going to emerge as certain forms of construction, and the constructions that we codify and organize into the theory of types will be, the goal is, to be sufficient to do any form of mathematics. Now, an interesting thing is going to come up, which is going to require me many rounds of iterative deepening to quell your misgivings. Somewhere in the back of your head, you know already that there's something peculiar about this particular notion of constructivism that Brouwer put forward, and that there is bias against it because Hilbert, perhaps the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, quite likely, was vehemently opposed to Brouwer's program of intuitionism because he was mistaken. And that's the part that is not so widely advertised as the fact that he was opposed. So Hilbert became such a giant in the field that if Hilbert said something, it was true, that's it. Okay, that who was going to oppose Hilbert? Well, Brouwer had the chutzpah to oppose Hilbert, but very few people could do that, okay? And Hilbert was actually wrong about some of the things he said, but that has given rise to this feeling that there's something deviant or contrary or incompatible between the constructive view and the traditional view that I've hinted at when explaining Brouwer's program. I'm going to attempt to show you through several levels of deepening that is not the case. Okay? In fact, in a certain sense, the type theory we'll develop is completely compatible with classical patterns of reasoning. There is no opposition there at all. Okay? There is no opposition. But it is very important for the purposes of everything I've said so far that the theory be constructive. And the reason is, and so the thing I want to flag on as an aside, okay, so this will come later, is I want to mention here, is the idea that is central is what is called the axiomatic freedom of constructive mathematics. And this is completely central. Hilbert understood, it appears, if you read like the Van Heijenoort compendium of articles about the foundations of mathematics, there are blatant, knockdown, practically bloody arguments between Hilbert and Brouwer on paper there. Hilbert believed that, Brouwer was negating everything that had been done so far, which is not the case. The best way to think about this is that it's just this. Fewer assumptions lead to stronger results. And so what Brouwer emphasized, for reasons that will become clear momentarily, in particular, the infamous law of the excluded middle. The requirement that every proposition is either true or false, Ordinarily, that's taken as a tautology not worth mentioning. But Brouwer, he denied it in the sense that he wished to not affirm it. It doesn't mean that Brouwer insisted that the negative is true. That is not the case. That is not what is going on. Okay? What is going on is simply the resistance to affirming this in general. Okay? At the very least, regardless of your foundational commitments and what you may believe, you have to agree with me. If you can prove a theorem with fewer assumptions, you've proved a stronger theorem. Okay? It's better. Okay? That's like not really arguable. Okay? That's like just a better way to go. So Brouwer was insisting that if you work with fewer assumptions, then you're going to get stronger results. And the program of homotopy type theory, exploits heavily this insight of Brouwer's. In particular, if you were to take Hilbert's principle that the law of the excluded middle holds universally for all propositions and types, I'll explain the connection in a second, you would deflate the entire program. Oh, hot ceases to exist. So not only was Hilbert's arguments historically wrong, they were mistaken, but if one were to adopt them on the basis of his authority, you would ruin something extremely beautiful and, I claim, useful. And why do that? Okay? So just to quell your doubts, some of you may have some doubts because you kind of are already allergic to Brouwer and constructivism because people told you to be. I want to sort of situate that so that you're not so like opposed. You know, some of that aversion is quelled. And in particular, another consequence here is that we can selectively, what's really important is to be able to selectively, or what I might call locally, introduce handy assumptions. So if you globally introduce the law of the excluded middle, this is in global form, globally, just always, then hot ceases to exist. It's gone. So it can't be done classically. I love this, okay? This is great because it tells us that, you know, it's just the whole idea. If you make fewer assumptions, you get stronger results. You get a richer arena in which to work. But then you can selectively relax those assumptions, or locally relax those assumptions, in order to recover an argument that you may have in mind. You can locally introduce instances of the law of the excluded middle, and I'll show you what are the limitations on doing that and so on, and how you should think about that. But if you just do it with a big hammer, then you've blown your foot off. Boy, that's a mixed metaphor. Okay, you've ruined the whole thing. Okay, so it's a mess. So I find it important to emphasize that the constructivity is central to the entire thing, but it's not a limitation. So this whole business about founding things on the basis of computation, so where does that come from? Okay, yeah. So now that's what I want to motivate next. So Brouwer famously emphasized the non-universal validity, let us say, of the law of the excluded middle. And that created a tremendous amount of friction. Hilbert described it as, you know, you're robbing a boxer of his gloves or something like that. Okay? Words like that. Okay? And but the question you must ask yourself is, why that law? Okay, it's all well and good to, you know, cut down on your assumptions. And if you make fewer assumptions, you're going to get a stronger result. Nobody would argue with that. Okay, but why that one? There's a lot of assumptions you could cut down on. Why not just pick some other random one out of the hat? Well, this has to do with computation, and that's what I'm about to explain. Okay, so it's not, I also want to say, it's not arbitrary which assumptions you deny. Okay. So it's all founded on the notion of construction. And if you think through carefully, what is the idea of a proof, for example, from the perspective of the notion of a construction, then you will be inevitably, irreversibly led to question the universal validity of the law of the excluded middle. And then you are a constructivist. And I know that a lot of people will think You know, your friends won't talk to you anymore. Okay? But you get used to that. There's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do about this, okay? The other thing I want to say here, which is I guess I should throw this in. Right now I'm emphasizing the logic aspect, and that's what I'm going to do right now. So let's now start out with what is meant by the idea of intuitionistic logic. And I mentioned this to you before. And I sometimes like to describe intuitionistic logic as if people mattered. And this is really just, oh, it's too bad I erased it. This is really just a formulation of Brouwer's principle, okay? Which is the notion of intuitionistic logic is grounded on the idea that it's a social process, and I'll explain why. So the intuitionistic logic presented in a modern form, this isn't, as far as I know, anything that Brouwer ever wrote down, but it's the type of thing that would make sense to him, is based on what Martin Löf elucidated as the concept of a judgment, and we'll write down a principle. Well, there are two principal judgments. I'm going to do the most elementary case here at the board in order to give you some ideas, which is A is a proposition. So this expresses the idea that A is a proposition. So you can think of this as the grammar. Okay, that just means I've said something well-formed, that it makes even sense to discuss it. And what does it mean to discuss it? It means to judge that it's true, which is A is a true proposition. And now the as people matter part is, which means it has a proof. This is the important idea. So the thing that is significant about Brouwer's analysis is it's a man's eye view of logic and math. That when you write down, when you see a textbook and someone writes theorem, every natural number can be written as a product of primes. I don't know, I just wrote that down for the hell of it. Okay? The person signals, here's your A. This expresses a proposition. In other words, you know what I just said. Okay? It makes sense. It's an English sentence. It asserts something about numbers. You presumably already know what numbers and primes are by the time we get to this theorem. So we expressed a proposition, and we are asserting that it is true. So this is the true part, by saying theorem. And of course, not being bogans, the first thing we do when we assert a theorem like that, we're very quick. You must do it instantly. You say, here's the proof. All right, I won't repeat the proof. And you bracket it. Now, sometimes you say, oh, this is so well known, we don't even bother to prove it. But then it's proved by reference, like in law. We'll say, well, we'll take it as included, as if that document were included here. Okay. So, but essentially what you do is you immediately write down the proof. So in the practice of the social processes of math, you don't ever get to say that something is true without giving a proof. So intuitionistic logic codifies that activity. That's it. Okay? That's what it does. There's no absolute thing. So what does that mean? So you can see immediately now that we do not expect, whoops, assuming, I'm foreshadowing here, that's why I put this in brackets here, that, for example, that either, for any proposition A, we can either prove it or refute it. And I could write that as A false. Let's say, let me just write A false here. Where A false means is refutable. I can exhibit a counterexample. So this means provable. I can give you a proof. let's say A false means it's refutable, I can give you a refutation. I haven't outlined exactly what I mean by that yet, but you can feel that. We don't expect that everything is either provable or refutable. Why? Because there are open problems. Okay, that's just the fact of life. And there are infinitely many problems and only finitely many of us. So there will always be, okay, open problems. So there's no reason to ever think that every proposition is either provable or refutable. That's obvious once you insist that being true means you know a proof. And I hasten to add, it's not a formal proof. You cannot reason, for example, by analyzing all possible proofs of something, because we don't know what are possible proofs of something in general. Okay? It's an open-ended concept. So that's a terminology that's used, and it's very important, which is the notion of open-endedness. That's a kind of an awkward phrase, but I wish I knew a better way to express. I wish I knew a synonym for that. That sounded nicer, but anyway, open-endedness, a little bit clumsy. Open-endedness is the principle that we do not imagine that we have circumscribed all possible forms of proof and all possible forms of argument, or that all the proofs have been written down in some systematic way, and those are the proofs forever and always. We do not make that commitment. If you make that commitment, oh my God, then everything is a mess, okay? So if you try to interpret A true means has a formal proof in a fixed formal system that I give in advance, as soon as you do that, you're wrong. Okay? That's the core of Gödel's argument, right? I cannot start out and tell you, here are all the ways you can prove something, and that's the end of it. Because as soon as I do that, then I can diagonalize out of it. So you're never going to win that game. Okay? So that's what I mean by open-endedness and why I want to distinguish the concept of formal proof from the concept of a proof.